Welcome back to Sputnik. It seems almost fanciful indulgence to be discussing human rights in today's Middle East, where an entire people's very existence is under threat, where dictatorship, usually Western-backed, has its boot on the throat of almost all of their people.
But that, in a way, is precisely why we must discuss it. After all, it is the so-called moral authority of democracy, the rule of law and human rights which Western countries perpetually draw upon when justifying their policies towards the rest of the world, which often includes invading and occupying it.
Rori Donaghy is a journalist who has a long track record of working in the region on subjects as diverse as the United Arab Emirates and all the way to Gaza and beyond. And I'm glad to say Rori joins us now. Now let's start at the Gulf, if we may. You and I both have our difficulties with some of the governments there. In your case, because you cast a critical eye, an objective, journalistic and analytical eye on one of the governments in the Gulf. This is par for the course, isn't it? If you look too closely into the Arab Gulf dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, well, you probably won't get back in.
Yeah, I think the Gulf monarchies have a long history of not tolerating any dissent, whether it's from their own citizens or external voices. And a large part of this is through the fact they don't want to open up a political space to allow people to be involved in the governance process. That's the history of monarchy, really, not just in the Gulf, but elsewhere. And there's very little to say that there's been any opening up in the Gulf states, although cities like Abu Dhabi and Dubai now enjoy global appeal. It's superficial, I think.
Yes, and of course the West is best friends with these monarchies. For all the talk of the need for human rights and the rule of law in a place like Syria, for example, the West seems to have very few difficulties dealing with the most authoritarian regimes in the Gulf. Is that all just about money?
I think that it's very difficult to view what the West does in the Middle East and the Gulf on a principled level. They clearly use language that suits their needs, whenever that may be, if it's human rights discourse or it's stability or it's anything they choose to get what they want. And more often than not, obviously, securing these interests involves oil contracts and arms deals and the such. Stability only matters when the interests are being met in the West, and so that discourse can be quickly abandoned for something else when they feel that there's a chance to further their interests, or if someone is maybe not quite playing ball when it comes to securing those contracts, money, whatever it may be. So I think that you can view any language used in the West by politicians as disposable. And it's very rarely, if ever, used on a principled level. I don't think this can be.
Tell me about Bahrain. This is one of the longest-running revolutions in the current Middle East. As a proportion of their tiny population, a very large number of people have been killed, wounded, tortured, imprisoned. Yet that never makes it onto the news, either in the Arab world or in the West. Why?
I think that a lot of people would say that it's got something to do with the US basing their Fifth Fleet on a strategically important island in between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's certainly the case, I think, in terms of the American policy. With Britain has a long history, of course, with Bahrain and continues to be its closest friend. We have a vested interest and very long, close relationship with the Sunni monarchy. And this flies in the face of a Shia majority who have been revolting now since February 2011 and appear no closer to achieving their goal. And in large part, I think that is down to the diplomatic support provided by Bahrain's allies, principally the UK and America.
And of course, across the causeway, Saudi Arabia. What's the current scorecard of human rights in our very best friend in the region?
I think Saudi Arabia has one of the most deplorable human rights records, not only in the region, if not the world. I mean, their toleration of dissent is really concerning. Their new terrorism laws this year have been used to prosecute human rights lawyers, and they tolerate very little open debate in Saudi Arabia. And obviously it goes beyond that, being the only country in the world that doesn't allow women to drive. And it also meddles in other places as well, including Bahrain, where obviously they sent in the troops in 2011 to break up protests at the Pearl Roundabout, which resulted in scores of deaths among protesters.
But aside from the politics, what about the human rights of individuals and the citizens across this region? I mean, there was a story this week I read of, a Saudi Arabian man being sentenced to 3 years and 450 lashes for meeting men through Twitter. You hear heinous things that happen to these individuals. What about their personal rights, their human rights?
Well, they don't have any in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where obviously homosexuality is not tolerated. In a country where you don't tolerate any criticism, they're not likely to be very open on their sexuality laws.
But why is there no fuss about this? Why aren't there campaigns, boycott demands and so on? Where are the pink campaigners who are always after Russia, for example, where no such thing could ever happen?
I think the people who campaign on gay rights are likely trying to make this cause, but it doesn't get into the mainstream discourse because of our very close ties with Saudi Arabia.
Now, no tour de horizon of human rights would be complete without talking about Palestine, which is the country existentially threatened, its very existence. The people, country long ago was wiped off the map, but the people are actually threatened now, especially in Gaza. What's, though, the situation in the West Bank, where you have ostensibly a Palestinian Authority? How are they doing on human rights?
Well, not very well. And I think that in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority in recent weeks, when there's been mass protests from Nablus to Ramallah and Hebron, they've been involved in shooting at protesters themselves, and a lot of Palestinians certainly view the authority as being acting on Israel and America's behalf, perhaps because of the funding and perhaps because of the actions that they've done. Scores of Palestinians have died in the West Bank in recent weeks since the Gaza offensive started, killed not only by Israelis but also with the willing complicity of the Palestinian Authority. Abbas is running around the region seemingly in a desperate fashion to try and reclaim some relevance in all of this. And I think also it has to be said that following the 2006 free and fair election in the Palestinian Authority, Hamas won and only were able to take power in Gaza forcibly from Fatah. So the Palestinian Authority certainly don't have a mandate in terms of representing the Palestinian people. And I think it's an urgent need for elections to be held so people can voice their concerns.
Well, to paraphrase Henry Kissinger, which is the first time I've ever done that, it's a pity they both can't lose. Hamas and Fatah have both seen their support fall markedly. Ironically, this Israeli invasion of Gaza, which is allowing the Palestinian resistance to get to grips face to face on the ground and taking quite a toll actually on the invading forces. It's probably done Hamas quite a bit of good electorally.
Yeah, I think that if you just look at the protests in the West Bank, there have been green Hamas flags flying in nearly all of them and in quite high numbers. And within Gaza itself, prior to this, as you rightly said, support for Hamas had fallen quite dramatically. They weren't governing very well. The people their lives was appalling. It's not necessarily just Hamas's fault. I mean, the 8-year-long siege is obviously changing things there. But this offensive certainly has markedly increased the support for Hamas. Whether this lasts for the long term is obviously unclear.
The catastrophe that's now unfolding in Gaza it's approaching Operation Cast-Lead levels of deaths, and I think has maybe surpassed Cast-Lead for wounded already. Atrocities like the bombing of United Nations schools and the destruction of the lives of scores of people in them, provoking the normally comatose United Nations even to raise a whimper of protest. How can we talk about human rights when there's actually an extermination going on?
I think it's difficult to talk in a traditional human rights discourse when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, because it does go beyond that. It goes to the very heart of the Palestinian issue, which is the seemingly intent of Israel to remove Palestinians from the land that they've inhabited for millennia. I also think that when you know the situation is terrible, when like today you have the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, issuing an editorial questioning Israel's actions in Gaza, I think that it's got to that point now where everyone is questioning what's going on. What's happened in Gaza is shocking to the whole world. Not only UN facilities have been attacked, but a disabled charity. You know, people have been killed. I was speaking.
Shifa Hospital. Hospitals have been regularly bombed and shot.
And I was speaking the other day to Hassan al-Halak. His family was bombed last week. He was the Gaza Scholar at Oxford Brookes last year. His house was bombed, his pregnant wife was killed, his 2 little boys, his mother and his sister. He has got first-degree burns over most of his body. I'm not sure that this can be in any way justified. It certainly doesn't fit into the terrorist narrative that Israel tells us, because Hassan was a bright young spark and is working at the Bank of Palestine and has been celebrated in the West academically, and his life is now torn apart. A ceasefire or an end to the occupation will not repair what's happened to that young man.
Can I get just one last quick answer from you? I'd like to tour this horizon with you all day. Egypt. We're now in a situation where Tony Blair and the Western governments are hailing the military junta of General Sisi. Yet human rights in Egypt are arguably, next to Gaza, the very worst of all. That's
certainly the case. I mean, an Egyptian monitoring group, Wiki Thrawa, say that there's been over 40,000 people jailed for political reasons since the military coup last year.
In what, a year and a half?
Yeah, well, just over a year.
Just over a year,
yeah. Hundreds sentenced to death. Whether this will be carried out or not, it isn't clear, but it doesn't really matter, because the idea is to spread fear amongst the population, not to question what's going on. And what we can see now with Gaza and Egypt is that Egypt are certainly part of an alliance with Israel. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of anger at the Egyptian ceasefire proposal, which many view as just being a Tony Blair initiative facilitated by the Israelis. And what's happened to Egypt is terrifying for the counter-revolutionary forces in the region, because they're trying to roll back the changes that we've seen since 2011.
Rori Donaghy, thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's